Being that Elden Ring hasn't received any updates or news for a while, now is a good time to start making content on the other Souls games, which is something that I haven't really done much on this channel, but for today we are going to be ranking the Dark Souls 1 boss soul weapons. Now this list is just going to be on the melee based weapons, so I'm not going to include things like the bows, shields, or catalysts because they're not really comparable and it will just be harder to rank as well. Now the boss soul weapons are the ones of which require you to trade in a plus 10 weapon alongside a boss soul to the giant blacksmith and he will forge you one of the weapons. So yes, this list is not going to include weapons that drop off bosses or boss tail cuts. Now as for the criteria, this list is just going to be based on how useful the weapon is just for PvE. I'm not going to take PvP into account, but if the weapon is better for PvP, I actually will mention it. But yeah, with that out the way, let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, we have the Dragon Bone Fist. Now to get it, you actually need a plus 10 fist weapon and the Iron Golem Soul. Now in the earlier games, fist weapons are just absolutely horrendous. I remember doing a Souls marathon with these things and they were just really bad in Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. But specifically for Dark Souls 1, these things have terrible damage, obviously get really bad range, and you can't even two-hand them. So you can't even like improve the damage or actually get a different type of moveset, which the moveset for fist weapons are just pretty slow in general to the point where there's daggers that is always going to outclass it. Now specifically for the Dragon Bone Fist, this one actually does get a unique heavy attack to which it does a nice cool upward cut that can send enemies into the air, which is pretty funny. But unfortunately, this thing is so ridiculously slow that it's just not viable at all. You're just sitting there like an absolute idiot charging up this fist weapon, not actually regenerating any stamina in that entire animation, and it does a stupid uppercut that has like zero range. Any enemy that just walks backwards like 2 steps is just gonna dodge it. And in the same time they could charge this attack up, you could just do like 2 light attacks and just end up doing more damage with a lot less risk and actually consuming a lot less stamina, which is probably the worst thing about this. It consumes so much stamina with this heavy attack, it's not even funny. Now there are a couple of positive things I can say about this. One, it is actually the only boss soul weapon that can be buffed, which pairing this thing alongside Crystal Magic Weapon or Dark Moon Blade is gonna be the only viable way to actually get some meaningful damage. And while this weapon is equipped, you also get a boost to your magic and fire defenses. So this could actually serve as a decent offhand option. Just have it equipped for parrying and you just get a boost to your defenses inherently. But I still would probably never want to do this because the weight of this weapon is way too high. It weighs 8 units, which for comparison, the Kestis weighs 0.5 units. And that is another fist weapon that probably just gets the better moveset, can do more damage, and you can infuse it. So yeah, this thing is absolutely trash, but thankfully they redeemed themselves with the Bone Fist and Dark Souls 2. Number 11, the Greatsword. Now this is a very mid weapon of a very mid boss. Now to get this, you need Gwyn's Soul and a plus 10 sword. Now obviously Gwyn is the final boss in the game and you have to get boss weapons in Anor Londo, so you actually can't acquire this weapon until 1.5 playthroughs in basically. And you'd think waiting that long would actually result in a very good weapon, but no, it's just a very generic greatsword with a basic quality scaling, a D in both strength and dexterity. You can't actually buff it, so almost every other greatsword is just going to outdamage this thing. And the only unique thing about it is going to be its heavy attack, which does flatten smaller enemies to the ground, which I guess is kind of fun. But in terms of just damage, it's just not going to be that good because it's very slow. And you can get about 2 light attacks off in the exact same speed that you can do this random heavy attack, and it'll just end up doing more damage. But the most frustrating thing about this is that when Gwyn uses it, he gets some really cool fire looking attacks, but when we use it, we obviously don't get anything cool like that. We don't get any fire effect at all or fire attacks. It's just a basic generic sword. Number 10, we have the Cursed Greatsword of Artorias. Now this is one of the 3 Artorias weapons you will see on this list, and this one is acquired off getting Sif's Soul and a plus 10 straight sword or greatsword. Now this weapon is actually a pretty decent greatsword, gets pure physical damage, gets nice quality scaling, so your total overall damage can actually be pretty decent. It does have a pretty nice heavy attack to where it does send enemies flying. The 2-handed version, I don't really care for it much because it is pretty slow for how much range that it does get, but the 1-handed version is a lot nicer because it's a very good poke that can lunge forward, so you actually get some nice range. And being that this weapon actually is cursed, you actually can damage the ghosts without having to use transient curse. So if you actually wanted to farm the ghosts to get their weapon, this actually might be the best weapon to do that with. Now there are going to be 2 main reasons as to why this is going to get lower on the list though. The first one being is that this thing gets a faith and intelligence requirement despite it not scaling with faith or intelligence at all. Now the good thing is if you actually don't hit the requirements for faith and intelligence, you actually don't lose any damage at all. But what will happen instead is that every single time that you hit with this weapon, it'll just deflect straight off and just bounce back, which is arguably like just as bad. But the main reasons as to why this is going to get lower on the list is because the Abyss Greatsword exists, which is just the exact same thing, but just better. Now you do acquire it later in the game because it is in the DLC, but that weapon just does more damage because it does scale with humanity. It is lighter and actually just gets the better heavy attack as well. So for me personally, I don't really see much of a use of this weapon. Number 9, we have just the regular Greatsword of Artorias. Now this weapon is also acquired by getting Sif's Soul, but you need a plus 10 and broken straight sword. And this weapon pretty much performs the exact same way as the cursed version in terms of its moveset and very similar requirements. but the main difference being is that this one actually does get split magic damage, which arguably is just worse than the cursed version because split damage is just not that good. But the reason I'm still going to put it a bit higher is because this actually does get scalings with every single damage stat. So at much higher levels, it actually can slightly outperform the cursed version of the Artorias sword, but even at fully max stats, it still doesn't really perform that well. You'd think it'd actually do a lot more damage than what it does, but it doesn't really. Now this weapon also does get 140 divine damage, which means you end up just doing more damage against skeletons and it's outright kill them as well without having to kill a necromancer, which this status effect compared to the curse status effect that the other greatsword gets, I feel like I'd just rather have the divine damage, because being able to outright kill skeletons and just do more damage to them, I feel like is just more useful than being able to damage ghosts without the use of transient curse. But if you wanted a greatsword that has some good synergy with some types of spells, there are just much better options out there. Number 8, Smough's hammer, the biggest of bonks. You get this bad boy by having a +10 hammer or great hammer and the soul of Smough. Now great hammers are probably not the easiest weapons to use because they're incredibly slow, but obviously they do a very high amount of damage per hit and they do stagger pretty nicely as well. And the Smough's hammer is no exception to that, and it could arguably just do it the best as well because its hammer actually has a very wide surface area, so it's going to be good at actually hitting multiple enemies at once and probably make it very hard to miss as well. And specifically with those two-handed heavy attacks, it serves as like a nice downward slam where you could actually treat it as like an AoE attack. Now this weapon also does get a very special effect in that it gets health regen per hit, but unfortunately it's 10 HP for every single hit, which on a weapon that's this slow is like borderline useless. But the fact that it still gets health regen is obviously nice. But unfortunately that is basically where all the positives ends because there's just a bunch of negatives afterwards. 1, it's the heaviest weapon in the entire game, weighing at 28 units, which is just ridiculous. 2, it has a strength requirement of 58, which is just so damn high. So it's only going to be good at higher levels because obviously you need a lot of strength and a lot of endurance for that equipment load. 3, it only gets a D-scaling in strength, and combined with the fact that you can't buff it, the total overall damage is not going to be that great. At that exact same level, the Dragon Tooth and the Great Club can do just as much damage, or if not more damage, and those things can actually be buffed as well. So like the Smough's hammer is just going to be on the lower end of the list in terms of great hammer damage. And probably the worst thing about this weapon, you can't see shit. Like, I can't see anything when using this weapon. It covers the entire screen. When you're indoors, you're just not going to be able to see whatever the fuck's in front of you. Like, look at this shit. It basically covers up the entire Xanthus crown. That's how big the fucking weapon is. At number 7, we have the Golem's Axe. Now, to get this weapon, you need a +10 axe and the Iron Golem Soul. And this is obviously just going to be a regular strength-based axe with a 36 strength requirement and a C scaling in strength. The total overall damage is actually not too bad, and it does just get the regular axe moveset, except for its one-handed heavy attack, which is going to be the most unique thing about it, because it actually does offer like this wind-based projectile attack that obviously does do pure physical damage. It doesn't have a wider hitbox, so you're only really hitting one enemy at once, but the projectile can actually do some nice damage. It staggers well, it goes relatively far. Now the downside being is that it does consume 30 durability, which is actually not that bad compared to most other weapons that actually have a projectile attack, because this weapon actually does get a total of 600 durability, so you actually can use a decent amount of projectiles before you do run out, but you definitely will eventually run out at one point, so you definitely do stack up on repair powders. But the projectile attack does actually perform best at point blank range because you also do get a hitbox with the weapon itself, so you're basically hitting with both the weapon and the projectile, and you're just doing a bunch of damage. Now there are going to be a couple of downsides to this weapon itself. 1, you can't really buff it and the strength scaling isn't really that great. So the total overall damage is going to be outclassed by a bunch of other axes in the game, namely like the Butcher's Knife or the Battle Axe. They can just easily outdamage this thing, even without a buff. And 2, this thing is just incredibly heavy. It weighs 16 units, which is comparable to like great axes in the game, which for comparison, the regular axe only weighs about 5 or 6 units. So there are some downsides to the weapon, but the projectile actually does make it a pretty fun option. Number 6, we have the Moonlight Butterfly Horn, which you get by having a +10 spear or rapier and the Moonlight Butterfly Soul. Now this weapon doesn't really do anything wrong at all. It's a spear that has nice range, only weighs 4 units, has low requirements, only 12 in strength and 14 intelligence. It does pure magic damage, so no split damage at all. And obviously the spear moveset, it's just going to be a bunch of poking attacks, which is really nice. Now unfortunately there's going to be like no horizontal swipes, so trying to hit multiple enemies at once is going to be pretty tough unless you're using the rolling attack. And the fact that it actually does do pure magic damage means you're not going to really benefit off using the Leo ring. But this is going to be a very solid sidearm option to have for your sorcery type of build because it's very low requirements, pure magic damage, nice moveset, it doesn't weigh much, and the damage, although it's not amazing, it's just not bad either. So yeah, I just think it's pretty neat. Number 5, we have the Dragonslayer Spear. Now to get this weapon, you need a +10 spear and the Soul of Ornstein. Now as I was saying with the Moonlight Butterfly Horn, spears are just going to be really good because they have nice range, you get really quick attacks, you can't ever go wrong with just thrusting attacks in general. Now for the Dragonslayer Spear in particular, it actually does get split lightning damage, but it does also get a faith scaling, so going into faith would actually improve the lightning damage, but going into dexterity will improve the physical. And it does get a beat scaling in both, but it actually does slightly scale better with that dexterity stat. But one thing to keep in mind is that this thing actually does get a special one-handed heavy attack, and that it does shoot out a lightning projectile, which this will actually also scale with that faith stat. Now the damage of this projectile isn't really anything too crazy, even if you do go into a bunch of faith, but the fact that you do have a very quick projectile that does only consume 20 durability every single time that you use it, it is going to be a nice option to have. But if you're going into more faith in general, you're better off just using miracles. Now there are a few things about this weapon that make me not really care about it much. And that's one, its weight. It does weigh 10 units, which is the heaviest or tied for the heaviest out of all the spears. Two, its requirements. It does get a higher strength and dexterity requirement, which dexterity is not too bad, but the fact that it gets a 24 strength requirement is still not that good, being that it doesn't really scale well with the strength. Probably the most disappointing thing about this weapon is going to be its total overall damage. Once you hit the soft caps of 40, you're not going to notice like much benefit at all. And that B scaling in faith should really be like a C or a D scaling, because it doesn't really give you many points when speccing into that stat. But the fact that it is a spear that gets some nice range and actually get a projectile attack as well, it's not going to be that bad of an option. Number 4, we have the Abyss Greatsword. Now this is acquired by getting a +10 Greatsword or Straight Sword and the Soul of Artorias. Now this is going to be the last Artorias Greatsword we talk about, and this one is very similar to the Cursed Artorias Greatsword. Gets that pure physical damage, gets very similar requirements, does get that quality scaling. Now yes, it does get those requirements in Intelligence and Faith, but once again, you don't actually have to meet those requirements to actually just maximize your damage, but you do have to meet those requirements if you just don't want your weapon deflecting after every single hit. But this one is just going to be better than the Cursed Artorias Greatsword because this also does scale with humanity. So the more humanity you have, stacking up to 10 times will actually just boost your damage. And having 10 humanity will just end up doing a bunch more damage than you ever could with the Cursed Artorias Greatsword. This one also does weigh a little bit less, only at 9 units. But definitely the best part about this weapon is going to be its heavy attack. The one-handed heavy is just a horizontal swipe, which is going to be good at crowd control and hitting multiple enemies at once. But the best part about the weapon is going to be the two-handed heavy attack that does that cool Artorias somersault front flip that slams the weapon down and squishes enemies. Now this attack, although it isn't the quickest and it is kind of hard to track, actually does lunge pretty fast, so it has some nice range. And the damage and the stagger potential makes it definitely worth using. Now unfortunately, it doesn't get any cool status effects like the other Artorias swords, but it's just a weapon that has a lot of damage and gets a nice moveset. Number 3, we have the Chaos Blade. Now you get this weapon by having a +10 katana and the Soul of Quelaag, and this is definitely going to be one of the more popular PvP type options because it's a katana, so it has an amazing moveset with those quick light attacks and especially those running attacks. But the Chaos Blade in particular just gets a very decent dexterity scaling, doesn't get too high of requirements, gets some very solid base damage, and actually does scale with your humanity stat. So the more humanity you have, the more damage you'll end up getting. And also combined with the bleed, it has ended up being one of the more premier options in the game. Now the downside to this amazing damage that you get is unfortunately every single time that you hit with this weapon, you also take damage yourself. And that's 20 HP with every single successive blow. Now 20 HP per hit is probably not that bad in a PvP setting, but for PvE it's a lot more noticeable because you're swinging your weapon a lot more in that. But there's other reasons as to why I still wouldn't really care to use a Chaos Blade in PvE, because the other katanas just also do the exact same thing but arguably just better, because the Chaos Blade is the only one that cannot be buffed. So using something like Uchigatana or the Iato or Washing Pole, all of those weapons can actually be buffed, which depending on your build can actually result in us more damage, and you don't even have to worry about how much humanity you have as well, so it's a lot easier to manage, and you just get the better heavy attacks with those type of weapons. The Chaos Blade heavy attacks are just not that good. The one-handed heavy attack is a bit too slow in my opinion, and the two-handed heavy attack I just am not a fan at all. I do not like that. The Uchigatana and Iato heavy attacks are just way better, but the weapon obviously still performs amazingly, and if you were to use it you would find plenty of success. Number 2, we have the Lifehunt Scythe. Now you get this weapon by having a +10 Scythe, Whip or Halberd and the Soul of Priscilla. Now this weapon is very similar to the Chaos Blade in that it might perform better in PvP, but in a PvE setting it's probably just a little bit outclassed. But that's not to say that this weapon isn't fun to use, because obviously it's a halberd that does get that slashing type moveset alongside the other scythes in the game, does get that nice downward swipe light attack combo, and the heavy attacks is actually a really nice lunge and horizontal swipe, which is good at hitting multiple enemies at once. It also gets a very quick running attack as well. Now the thing that actually makes this weapon unique is that it does get bleed, but actually gets a more buffed up version of bleed. The regular scythes only get about 30 bleed build up per hit, whereas a Lifehunt Scythe gets about 50 bleed up per hit. And proccing bleed with this weapon actually does take away 50% of the enemy's health, whereas regular bleed is only 30%. And against bosses, this will take away 15%, which the regular version is only 10%. Now you might think that this is like honestly amazing and broken, but unfortunately the downside is that when you actually hit with this weapon, it actually does inflict bleed upon yourself as well. Now the bleed buildup is actually less than what you inflict upon the enemy, but you still take that 50% damage every single time that you proc bleed upon yourself, which if you're fighting multiple mobs, it's definitely going to be very noticeable. You're going to be taking a lot of damage quickly, which might not be that big of a deal in this game because you do get 20 whole flasks, which is like more than enough to take you from area to area. And against boss fights, if you actually do end up pacing yourself and only attack when you have openings, very rarely would you actually proc bleed upon yourself, because the amazing bleed that you get combined with the amazing damage that you get which this thing gets a very decent dexterity scaling that actually does scale pretty well even past 40 dexterity. Most other weapons have a dramatic fall off. This one actually still gets a decent amount of AR afterwards. So it can definitely outperform a lot of the other weapons in the game. But I still would probably rather have the Great Scythe because that weapon can just be infused and buffed, so it could probably result in us more total overall damage. It also gets more range and there's actually no downsides at all. You don't proc bleed on yourself like you do with the Lifehunt Scythe, but it still makes for one of the better weapons in the game and actually still is incredibly fun to use. Number 1, the Quelaag's Furysword. Now you get this weapon by having a +10 curved sword or curved greatsword alongside the Quelaag Soul. And this weapon probably doesn't perform as well as something like the Chaos Blade and the Lifehunt Scythe would, but as I said with those two weapons, they're probably directly outclassed by something else in the PvE department, whereas a Quelaag sword is probably not necessarily the best curved sword in the game. It actually does some things that no other curved sword does do. And the main one being is going to be its amazing range. It's a curved sword, so it has like a very quick light attack combo, but it gets like twice as much range as almost any other curved sword in the game. But this weapon is still just amazing because you get some very solid damage, get a nice dexterity scaling, you get low requirements. It also does scale with your humanity stats, so just having more humanity would just result in even more damage. It's extremely light, only weighing at 3.5 units. It does actually get split damage, which is unfortunate, but most of that damage is actually fire damage, which a lot of things in this game are actually weaker to fire damage. But most importantly, look how cool the weapon looks. It has like the coolest looking fire effect in the game. It's just really neat. I like it a lot. Anyway, that concludes the list. Just let me know what your thoughts are down below. I actually do plan on making some more Dark Souls related content, whether it be going over like the top 10 weapons or just ranking the spells or whatnot. Definitely just comment down below if you actually want to see those type of videos and do subscribe for them as well. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Bye.